Is there any, Brianna, is there any housekeeping that you need to announce at the beginning, or?
I'm going to do a very, very brief thank you for joining us, an intro for you guys, and then kick it right off to you. Okay, so we can get started. Just a little heads up, this is being recorded, but thank you all so much for joining us today. Today's topic, as I'm sure most of you know, is School to Prison Pipeline, and I am very pleased to welcome Lisa Tesler from the PADD Council, Kay Eva Weiss, Paris Boyd, and Grace Faye Cooper, all from the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University, and last but not least, Morgan Blacksmith from the Project for Youth Educational Success and the Support Center for Child Advocates. And I'm going to kick it right off to Lisa.
Great, thank you, Brianna. So can everyone see the School to Prison Pipeline? Am I sharing my screen properly? Yes, okay. Paris is my go-to guy for the thumbs up. Thank you. So welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Tesler. I'm the Executive Director of Pennsylvania Developmental Disabilities Council. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with you the good work that's happening in Pennsylvania around the School to Prison Pipeline. As Brianna mentioned, the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University and the Support Center for Child Advocates are joining me today to share with you the important work they've been doing in this initiative. So I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about why Council wanted to and thought it was important to address this issue. So the School to Prison Pipeline is a nationwide process in which local, state, and federal education and public safety policies push students out of school and into the juvenile criminal justice system. Schools directly send students into the pipeline through policies that exclude students from learning environments and involve police in minor incidents that often lead to students' removal from school through arrest, citation, fines, juvenile detention referrals, and even criminal charges. Police officers are getting involved in routine student conflicts and disciplinary matters that are not particularly dangerous or violent. These policies and practices have the disproportionate effect of pushing students, especially those most at risk, including students with disabilities, out of classrooms and into juvenile criminal justice systems through school-based arrests. So the council wanted to address this practice. We heard from advocates, individuals, students, families, and other stakeholders that the School to Prison Pipeline was having a dramatic and negative effect on people with disabilities, students with disabilities, especially those who are children of color and LGBTQ youth. So what we learned when we were doing the research 5-6 years ago, as we embarked on these efforts, is that there's disparities. 5 or 6% of students without disabilities are suspended versus 11% of students with disabilities suspended. 5% of white students were expelled versus 16% of Black students expelled. Black girls are suspended at higher rates than girls of any other race. We also learned that gender non-conforming girls are up to 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary practices. And LGBTQ youth comprise 13 to 14% of the juvenile justice system, and yet are only 5 to 7% of the population. And 60% of those youth are Black or Latino. 85% of youth in juvenile detention facilities have disabilities that make them eligible for special education services, yet only 37% are receiving services while in school. And research shows that implicit bias may contribute to these disparate disciplinary practices. So we set out in our last 5-year plan to address this issue. And our objective statement is long and wordy, but it does show you that what we intended to do was ensure that children and youth who are disproportionately affected by policies and practices that deprive them of regular education, especially those with disabilities, are provided with equal opportunity and access to quality educational and instructional time, as well as supports and services that allow them to be maintained in the regular classroom. So what did we hope to accomplish? We had several expectations when we embarked on this effort. We were hoping to increase awareness of the impact of the School-to-Prison Pipeline on students, especially those from marginalized communities. We hope to establish collaborations with stakeholders from diverse communities. We wanted to increase access and referrals to community-based and inclusive resources and services, and decline the number of students who are suspended, expelled, or sent to alternative placements. And we hoped that the disparities along disability, racial, and other lines would decrease. We also set forth a reentry initiative that would assist students who are in the pipeline to re-enter regular schools and regular classrooms with all the resources, supports, and services they needed to succeed. So that's the why. That is why we got where we are. Based on those objectives and outcomes, we funded 3 organizations to do work in Pennsylvania. So the first organization I'm going to talk about is Delaware County Advocacy and Resource Organization. They were not able to be here today to present, so I'm going to just give you a short idea of the work they've been doing. So their project was entitled Enriching, Supporting, and Engaging Lives, and they were one of the 2 diversion projects. And they used an approach based on Dr. Ross Green's research around collaborative, proactive solutions. They used mindfulness training for both students and faculty. And the mindfulness training for students focused on helping them negotiate and understand their own emotions and behaviors. And then they also incorporated training for students, principals, and other school personnel on implicit bias, the relationship between punitive practices and the school-to-prison pipeline, and alternatives to those punitive practices to avoid funneling children into the pipeline. They are now working on completing a documentary, and this documentary is showing how they've been incorporating the mindfulness into the school. So what I'm going to show you now is just a 2-minute clip of, this is hot off the presses, just got it this morning, and this will give you a sense of the type of work they're doing in this school. All right, so my speaker's not working. You guys can't hear that. Let me try that again. Okay, well, shucks. All right.
Can I offer
but-
one suggestion?
Sure.
I have had this trouble before. Perhaps when you shared your screen, did you select the setting to share sound as well? There's a setting for that. That might be what is happening, but I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. I did not have to do that when I tested it this morning. So
Oh, okay.
that's a shame. So what I'm going to do is, let me try again, because when I tested it, it did work this morning. Let me find the link. It just auto played for me, of course.
You are invited to close your eyes so that you feel like you can be relaxed but awake at the same time. And I invite you to rest in any stillness, any quiet that might be here for you. And just like we did before, kind of just feeling ourselves sitting here. And just allow yourself to be.
Going deep into your mind and thinking about something that you probably never thought about before and sorting it out with your own self.
It's a lot to go to school and try to be who you are. You got so many different personalities.
When I have mindfulness in my mind, it keeps me, like understanding and who I need to be, of the exact person I need to be.
I have seen mindfulness programs be real game changers for children.
I kind of learned a lot in how to control my anger because I do get angry pretty quickly and ready to act instead of thinking.
Mindfulness works in a school like Toby Farms because, like many schools, it's so much going on. It's the rotation of classrooms. It is the dribbling of basketballs. It's the tweeting, the bulk blasting. It's hiding the phones underneath the desk. It's a middle school.
And as you're writing, I invite you to just become aware of the feeling of your breath, as you also are aware of the waves.
It's like an ocean wave. When something hits, it makes a big like tsunami. But when you do mindfulness, it like stops.
Where we are with mindfulness now, we're in the right direction, but I feel like we're at a point where if nobody's going to advocate for it, I don't know where it's going to end up.
Mindfulness is saying, hey, Toby, let's slow down. Let's just take a break to reflect.
So there's the short clip that we've just received, and I must say I was very impressed. In mid-pandemic, they were able to switch gears and move to a virtual schools and still accomplish the work. So very impressive. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Temple to talk about their project.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks so much to the National Association of Councils for having us here to talk about our work. This is a project that we've actually completed for now, although we are continuing to develop it in other ways. And the project was called Deconstructing Racism and Ableism in the School-to-Prison Pipeline. We're going to talk specifically about two different online virtual trainings that we did, one called Building a Foundational Knowledge Base and another called Moving from Awareness to Action, but we will kind of provide an overview of the project as a whole. So we're from the Institute on Disabilities, which is the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities for the state of Pennsylvania, and we're located at Temple University. And this project was funded by the PADD Council and also in partnership with the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at the University of Pennsylvania. And we'll take a second to introduce ourselves. Grace, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Grace. I'm a research assistant at the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Temple University.
Thanks. And my name is Ava Weiss. I started like Grace as a graduate assistant. So I was a trainee, which is one of the core functions that a USAID completes. And now I'm a research staff. I'm a research associate there. So as I said, the USAID is one of 67 centers. Ours is the only one in Pennsylvania, and we focus on technical assistance and community education, pre-service training, such as for graduate students, research and evaluation, and information dissemination. So I think you'll see with the School to Prison Pipeline project how that kind of brings a lot of things together: the technical assistance and community education piece, training for graduate assistants through involvements in the projects, and then it involved a lot of research and now information dissemination. Oh, we can move on to the next slide. Thanks.
So our project was titled Project Play Inclusive and the School to Prison Pipeline. There were an intervention and as well as community trainings for the project that specifically addressed the intersection of racism and ableism in the school to prison pipeline. And much of this work was founded and utilized various frameworks from Dr. Howard Stevenson at the University of Pennsylvania. And for our project, we went with the ACLU's understanding of the school to prison pipeline, which mirrors much of what Lisa has already said. But I'll read that here for you. So the school to prison pipeline is a national trend wherein children are funneled out of schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Children of color and those with learning disabilities or histories of poverty, abuse, or neglect are particularly at risk. Next, thank you. So the first part was an intervention, and the interventionists were the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at the University of Pennsylvania, so specifically led by Dr. Howard Stevenson and many of his team members. They partnered with the Northeast Treatment Centers of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And then the intervention took place from November 2019 until February of 2020, 2 evenings a week for about 10 weeks. And in that time, students participated in various curriculum to address issues that were relevant to the intervention. There were about 18 to 21 youth each session, and all of the youth were connected already to the juvenile justice systems. And then along with the along with the intervention were a series of community-driven trainings for professionals and individuals that work within the school system, the social work system, the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, anybody who would be in touch with or be a part of what is going on with the children that were part of the intervention. And this way we would capture both pieces. So the community-driven trainings, we had two. First was a building a foundational knowledge base, and the second training, moving from awareness to action. We had 5 live training sessions in 2019 with 45 participants across the Southeast Pennsylvania. And then with the onset of the pandemic, we switched to digital trainings, and those have been recorded and are available to the public on the Institute's website as of spring 2020. So whenever you would like to look, you can absolutely find them there. Next slide, thank you. So the trainings were facilitated by 4 individuals, and you can see their photos here, names and information. I'll introduce each of them briefly to give you a sense of who was facilitating the trainings and what they brought to this intersection of ableism and racism in the context of the school to prison pipeline. So first we have Sean Aliong, who is a legal studies major and undergraduate at Temple University. He's also a civil rights and disability rights activist. We have Stormy Kelsey. She's a media and communications coordinator at Temple University Community Collaborative, and works and spends her time working with youth and students of color. Mozzie Ingram is a senior at Franklin Learning Center, as well as a senior producer at Poppin, which is an organization that produces media materials around various social justice causes. And then we have Sally Gold Taylor, who is the executive director at the Institute on Disabilities. And these were our 4 trainers for the 2 trainings that we mentioned earlier. And then just to give you a sense of what was covered in both of those trainings, we have these topics. So we covered, what does race and disability have to do with each other? Specifically looking into the history of racism, ableism, eugenics, and marginalization, as well as the history of racism and ableism in the school to prison pipeline. We approached various tools for dismantling the school to prison pipeline in Philadelphia, and then left off with the question, how can youth take action? Leading that into our second training, which was mostly about taking action. And so there we talked about how to resolve race and disability stress in everyday life, using storytelling for social change, and then gave participants an opportunity to work through their own stories of racism, ableism, and the school to prison pipeline. So the trainers gave examples of their own stories, and we invite participants to look into their stories as well. And then we offered some strategies for action and continued education on the school to prison pipeline. And there were several learning objectives. First was that participants would understand the historical relationship between race and disability, or racism and ableism. And second, that they would understand how disability and ableism fit into the school to prison pipeline. Third is that participants would have an overview of tools to combat racist and ableist tensions in context of everyday life. And then that they would challenge themselves to be uncomfortable and to grow. And then learn about ways to take action against race and disability-based discrimination. And throughout the trainings, various topics were discussed that could be sensitive in nature. So as we did our trainings, we reminded participants to pause and breathe and reflect by indicating that with purple flowers.
Thanks, Grace. I'm gonna go back to that idea in a minute before we play some video clips. You know, some of the content can be definitely very triggering to people, and I'll provide some you know, details as to if you need to step away and come back as to what you should look for. We're going to present a few data points first, and this sort of correlates with what Lisa was describing in the beginning. So the statistics might look a little bit different, but I think they all really tell, you know, the same message, and we have a lot of work to do. So from the ACLU, they cite that Black students are suspended and expelled 3 times more than white students. And this is an infographic with one person sort of set in contrast to 3 people in outline. And then in another infographic from Color Lines, kids with disabilities are entering the juvenile justice system at a rate 5 times higher than youth in the general population. And so you have 10 students on one side compared to 2 on the other to differentiate between just the scale at which kids with disabilities are being funneled in. And then another infographic from the University of Minnesota that describes that 32 to 40% of the US prison and jail population has at least one disability, so nearly half, whereas only 11% of the US population has at least one disability. So a lot of disproportionality in the population of people in prison and jail settings. Also, 4 to 10% of the US prison and jail population has IDD, or an intellectual or developmental disability, as compared to 1.5% of the US population with an intellectual or developmental disability. So now we're going to turn it over. I'm going to turn it over to Mazi, who was one of our trainers and who actually just graduated. So she's headed off to college and we're really excited for her. And she's going to break down in her words what the School to Prison Pipeline is.
I'm not so sure the audio is coming through.
Primarily affects children of color and children with learning disabilities or history of poverty, abuse, or neglect, and they're particularly at risk. This also directly connects to the school to prison deportation pipeline. So this primarily affects immigrant students whose parents may not be documented or they're on extended visas and things like that. We've noticed a trend over the last few years of ICE infiltrating schools, although they agree not to do that. So one of the biggest ways that you'll find students are being harassed at schools are through school resource officers or school police. On your screen, you'll see an image, a graphic of a police officer in a shadow-like figure and some students behind them, and there's a few facts I'll read off for you. So the first one, there are 1.7 million students in schools with police, but no counselors. 3 million students are in schools with police, but no nurses. 6 million students are in schools with police, but no schools psychiatrists. 10 million students are in schools with police, but no social workers. 14 million students are in schools with police, but no counselors, nurses, psychologists, or social workers. This trend is very similar to what we see in other aspects of our world. You know, when we look at the overfunding of police, it's the same thing happening in schools. Their resource officers aren't trained to handle situations that aren't violent. So a lot of times when students are in situations that can be handled in a non-violent manner, these officers aren't trained on de-escalation, and usually it leads to the students being negatively affected, whether through their mental health, their physical health, or even as far as them being arrested and ending up with a disciplinary record.
We're going to continue along those really important points that Mazi was making about the allocation of resources and sort of just an impulse towards handling and managing different personalities and interpersonal relations with aggression versus with other tactics. And I'm going to ask everybody to sort of return to that idea of the flower. So we're going to play a video clip within our training module that will be discussed. And so that happens around minute 2 of the next clip and goes on for about, I'm sorry, it happens around minute 6 of the next clip, and it happens for about 2 minutes. And it is going to detail police brutality. So there is a visual, it's not super clear, but definitely the audio is can be really unsettling. So we will return to a slide that reads connections as the, on this sidebar where you see racism and ableism right now. When we return to that slide, you'll know that triggering conversation has ended if you need to mute or step away. So in the next clip, it begins with one of our other trainers, Sean Aliong, discussing the relationship between racism and ableism, and then providing sort of context to disentangle what was happening in a video clip that was featured. So we can roll the clip.
What do race and the disability have to do with each other? Race and the disability are constructed ideas, not biological fact. But yet it's an impact with racial and disability stigma produce biological consequences. So in other words, the race and the disabilities are not all social concept, but because of the stigma that people might have because of people of color and people that have the disability, it can lead to consequences that turn out to be logical. Point number 2, the disabilities has been described as like from a other race. Geraldine Thompson, 1997, comment with racial inequality and attempt to justify by correlating race with the fact back in 2016 classified people of race or the disability have been used for a tool for exclusion. We can never assume a person's race or the disability. So in other words, so society has always have judged or assumed what your social or even biological based on your disability, based on your race. And oftentimes that also a young black man. So together, it can lead down to a very dangerous path in some aspect. That's why race and the disability is so important to talk about. Fight for equal justice for both people of color that have the disabilities and oftentimes it's not trained to work with someone that have the disabilities because police brutality is at an all-time high. We know when it comes to people of color, but also as you will see as in the next video, police brutality is also at an all-time high when it comes to people with the disabilities. And police are not trained to deal with someone that have a disability. So that needs to change. I'm going to keep it real. That video was discussing, that video shows how some police don't have no regard for people that have the disability or people of color. For policemen to not have training on how to stop someone that is deaf is outrageous. And then they have enough to laugh and they will put him back on the cruiser like I'm solving for officers so that they can get the proper training to deal with people with autism, people that are deaf, people that have different types of disabilities, and they need to be held to a higher standard when they fail to do so.
Sean, I think that's a great point. Yeah, I piggybacking on what Sean said, I agree with him completely. I also want to bring up the point that when we talk about training, I think we should focus more on retraining the system, because at the end of the day, as harsh as it may sound, police are doing their job, but when their job is when their job is wrong, they're going to do the wrong thing. So I think a big part of the conversation should be, if cops are getting these billion-dollar budgets, why aren't they being trained? Why are the disparities still here? Watching the video, like Sean said, it's very disgusting to watch these police officers land. I feel like if a person with any moral compass was in that situation, that would be the last thing you could do. Yeah, I agree with you both. I think outside of, the story itself and the video is gut wrenching, and then to hear the laughter is just like sickening. And I also think a point that they brought up is how they were covering each other. Like, oh, when you put it in your report, explain that basically, if we want to translate it, he basically said that it was his fault, that it was Pearl's fault for being beaten because he didn't have any signs on his car or inside the vehicle. Even though he had the sign, but they wanted to use aggression before they asked questions. They wanted to, that's the thing I believe with most police officers, and as you were saying, Ozzy, is the system itself that teaches them to be agitators. They come out of the vehicle defensive. They come out of the vehicle ready to fight someone, ready to shoot someone, actually, because he had the gun drawn. He had the gun drawn before he even came up to the window. And that itself is a problem. And I hope those officers are actually being investigated, but I guess, yeah. No, Stormy, I think it's a great point. And I think this also goes back directly to what Sean was talking about a few minutes ago with the slide where he was talking about how race and disability are socially constructed. You heard that the officers were assuming that this was a person without disability because they didn't think he looked like what they had been constructed to understand as a person with disability looks like, right? They assumed that he was a person who could hear and speak audibly. And they kept saying, why didn't he tell us he was deaf, right? So it goes back to the fact that we can't make assumptions about people's race, and we can't make assumptions about disability based on those preconceived social constructions that we've been taught, both as individuals and how systems have been created and taught.
So I know some of that audio, it's sort of like a video, and a video is probably a little too much for Zoom to handle. So we're happy to discuss those clips and how they are sort of representative of the larger training more in the Q&A, which I'll move to really fast. So I'll just sort of speed through these next couple slides. Other way, I think. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So some of the major themes that come through in the training are the relationship between race and disability as social constructs, but with biological consequences through racism and ableism. Also sort of looking at a historical understanding of sort of the origins of eugenics and things like that, all the way until the contemporary moment, how those things sort of continue, the new eugenics, how they kind of continue to affect us in local ways and things that are happening internationally. So there's a lot of a lot of cross-pollination happening in this training module. And of course, like any good training, it provides a lot of resources and a lot of education, and it raises a lot more questions than answers. And we invite people in the module, both as part of participating and engaging in that really hard and brave work. It's to take on their own short and long-term commitments. So that was something when we were doing the in-person trainings that people were able to then discuss about how they were going to take the tools that they were learning back into their office spaces or into different professional settings or even at home, and use some of the tools they learned to sort of spread the message. We also, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A with Grace, is we met a lot of challenges, particularly related to the pandemic. So you can, we can go on to the next slide. So we had started this project in person, and even before the pandemic, we just, the nature of academia, our partners at REC changed. So Dr. Stevenson was, he has a very, he's renowned and has a cadre of graduate students who are very eager to work with him. And then once they have that phenomenal training, they move on to really other phenomenal things. So the other assistants in REC that we were working with who had partnerships in schools that we had planned to do these interventions ended up taking different professional opportunities to amplify their work, which was phenomenal, but it meant we had to start over in terms of building new partnerships and new relationships with schools, and schools, certainly schools that are any school, of course, because you're dealing with children and youth, but particularly schools that have other, intersectional vulnerable constituents and populations to think about, have concerns about having universities come in and perform research. So, a big lesson that we always are learning strategies to deal with is how to build partnerships consistently outside of sort of individual projects, so that those relationships are in place and that trust and rapport is really strong, and so that we're offering the right kind of supports that makes sense for that community, that we really have an understanding of what's needed on the ground. Also, just in terms of with COVID and with just what's going around, what's been going on in the country for centuries, but particularly has been amplified in the last 2 years around conversations around police brutality and racial justice and social justice and inequities. There's just a lot of burnout. People are very busy. They're doing a lot of really tremendous emotional, physical work, and it was hard sometimes to get, to meet our self-imposed deadlines and objectives. We had to be really strategic and, really human about what we were trying to accomplish and make sure that it was really serving the population that needs to be served. Again, so we can talk about more of this in the Q&A for a couple minutes that are left. And just want to invite you, I had put the link to the modules and to our other resources in the chat box already, and I can put it in there again. It's just disabilities.temple.edu/school-2-prison. So there you have the modules, you have access to videos, news articles, op-eds, data sources, different literature reviews, and then here is our contact information. So I'll make sure to move that all into the chat box, and we're interested in, we're almost out of time, but we'll be happy to take a couple questions.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about the school to prison pipeline and as it relates to disability? Like, are you seeing this with a number of, people who have like a certain kind of disability, or are you seeing this with all kinds of disabilities?
Well, I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. Our research was not sort of surveying or doing like an assessment of which youth were being funneled directly into the school to prison pipeline according to different demographic measures. But I think what's made clear by our more kind of broad educational approach about looking at the sort of under the way racism and ableism undergirds so much of our systems and so much of the way our society is designed is to show that really this affects everybody. And it's really a poison to everybody. So when we start to draw those connections, you know, this is not about sort of like identifying a certain student at risk, at least from our ends, from our project design, as much as identifying the ways that systems need to be changed. So this is not just about classrooms, it's not just about teachers, but it's about reaching sort of like the entire professional provider world, families, everybody who are, you know, impacting the way students and youth's lives look, and how, you know, they are able to live and try things without risking, you know, their entire future.
Ava, did you see the message in the question in the chat?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I was just typing in the link. Yeah, that's a really important question and something that we're working on a lot. And I think, you know, we have been having one of the benefits of our current situation is that we can have so we're so accustomed to being on Zoom and meeting people sort of in tinier moments of time, right? We don't have to think about driving across the city or taking the bus or whatever, or driving across the Commonwealth or the nation to meet with people who are, you know, to have the right stakeholders at the table. So that's been really beneficial for us to kind of show up and have meetings that are not necessarily project focused. So not, I have this project, I have this funding starting, and we need to get started and we have this deliverable in a year, but sort of having these ongoing conversations has been crucial, and just watching it build. So Poppin, which was one of our major partners in this work, where Stormy and Mozzie came to us from, we've continued developing that relationship, and we are, through that relationship, getting more and more connected to different high schools and to different racial empowerment groups in and around Philadelphia. So I think it's just a matter of showing up and then sort of building those relationships day by day, as opposed to maybe sort of focused on a project level.
And I'll just add on to that before we switch to the next speaker. One of the things that our council hosts is what we call our Community Alliance Summit, which is coming up in about 2 weeks. And it's an annual event where we bring representatives from a variety of groups together. And that helps us as a council connect to those diverse communities. You can find information around the Community Alliance Summit on our website, and I can type it in the chat. And since it's Zoom and not in person, if you're interested in seeing what that looks like in Pennsylvania, you can join us for the summit, and I'll share that with everyone. Okay, so let's move on to Morgan and Paris. And I believe you're going to share your slides. Thank you so much to Grace and Eva for your presentation. And I don't need to stop sharing, right? You'll just take over.
Hopefully we just did it.
Perfect, thank you. Okay.
All right, great. Thank you, Lisa.
Sure.
And I apologize because it looks like our first few slides with our introductory material aren't on this slide deck. But that is okay because we were going to be introducing ourselves to you anyway. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us today and for the opportunity to share with you some of the work we've been doing around what's called the School-to-Prison Pipeline reentry. My name's Morgan Blacksmith. I'm here from the Support Center for Child Advocates. My office is a direct service provider. We provide legal services and social services to young people in Philadelphia who have been abused or neglected and who are involved in the child welfare, otherwise known as the dependency system. Most people sort of think of it as, oh, we're lawyers for kids in foster care or who have been placed outside of their home because of abuse or neglect. And I'm here today on behalf of a small team from the support center that's been doing this work. In addition to myself, we've had a social worker and a policy associate with us. And we've also been really grateful to be able to partner with Temple and specifically with Paris. And I'll let him introduce himself.
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Paris Boyd. My pronouns are he, him. I work at the Institute on Disabilities with Ava and Grace. So I won't spend too much time talking about the Institute on Disabilities, but how I come to this work is at the Institute, I work on projects around criminal justice. And so this is kind of getting into that work and bringing the perspective of people with disabilities to this project. And so this is on a slide that was there. So I'm just gonna kind of talk you through the objectives that we are hoping we accomplish through this presentation. The first one being that you will understand the importance of considering educational reentry as part of the school-to-prison pipeline. We're hoping you will learn about our project's methodology and the process of information gathering, which combines a comprehensive literature review with dozens of interviews of staff and administrators at schools, school districts, congregate care facilities, and other related professionals, as well as youth and families who have experienced educational reentry. And then that you will be presented with a summary of the project's findings and how those findings were transformed into self-advocacy materials for youth and their families, and a best practices guide for professionals, and a pilot project providing transition services directly to youth leaving juvenile justice facilities in Pennsylvania. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Morgan.
Thanks, Paris. And the way that we want to start with this is to sort of describe like what school-to-prison pipeline reentry is and why it's important to talk about as part of the school-to-prison pipeline. So if you do a Google image search of the school-to-prison pipeline, you will likely see some variation of this picture. You'll see a school, and then you'll see some mechanism, and then you will see a picture of a prison or other institutional facility where the young person is sent. So we start off with this really basic conceptualization of what the school-to-prison pipeline is. Most school-to-prison pipeline work, including what we just heard about from Ava and Grace, and the video that Lisa shared earlier from the other PADD Council grant recipient, looked at the beginning of the school-to-prison pipeline. So the portion of the school-to-prison pipeline that has to do with the schoolhouse, right? We want to stop it from happening. Oh. And somehow my slides are not advancing. So let's try this again. All right, this is where school-to-prison pipeline work normally looks at the schoolhouse at the outset. It's really important work, and we'll talk through the course of the next 20 or so minutes about why, because of some of the harms that can come to young people. But first, as we started to do this work, we realized that it's not just school-to-prison pipeline that is happening. Behaviors in schools, school policies and practices are sending kids out of their community schools to other institutional settings too. So they're being sent to, certainly to secure juvenile facilities. It's sort of the prison that we think about classically. But kids in the juvenile justice system may also be placed in group homes or other non-secure facilities. Kids get pushed out into the child welfare or the dependency system, where they also may go to an institutional or residential placement. And kids get pushed out of school into the behavioral health system. It could be for residential treatment, it could be for drug and alcohol treatment. All of these places are places where young people may end up. And we, in our work, realized that it makes sense to look at all of these institutional facilities together, because it's the same kids and families, oops, yikes, there we go, who are getting caught up in the system, in the pipeline. They have the same cycles, the same problems. And in terms of reentry, schools treat all these kids the same way as they're coming back. So what does it look like when a young person is being pushed out of school? We're talking about some general harms of residential placement. And we know empirically from several decades worth of research that sending kids to institutions and outside of family settings is not good for them. Specifically, there's concerns about abuse, about dangerous conditions. Emotionally, it's enormously important to consider the impact of separating a young person from their family or community. All of those things and other experiences can exacerbate prior trauma that those young people experienced. And as we've already talked about a couple times today, these things disproportionately harm youth of color, youth with disabilities, and youth who identify as LGBTQIA+. So some other harms from sending kids out of their communities into these residential placements is, in Pennsylvania at least, the quality of the education that they get there is really, really poor. In Pennsylvania, typically there's an on-ground school at each of these residential placements. They're not, with very, very few exceptions, they are not public schools. They're not held to the same expectations or requirements as a public school in Pennsylvania, which means that their teachers don't have to be qualified in any real sense. They don't need to offer young people classes that they need in order to earn high school credits to move towards graduation. Their academic expectations of kids are low. We get a lot of reports of, well, they gave me a packet of worksheets, or I'm in 10th grade and the math they gave me was addition and subtraction and we did a lot of coloring, or it's all computer-based instruction. We never even see a teacher. We know that young people in these settings aren't generally earning helpful credits to get them towards graduation. And in particular, we know that special education supports are unidentified, misidentified, over-identified, all at the same time. And one really problematic thing that we see in Pennsylvania is these residential settings have a kid come in, student has an IEP, the residential setting, the on-ground school says, well, you know, we offer supplemental emotional support here. And so we're going to unilaterally change this young person's IEP to give them supplemental emotional support because that is what we offer. They tend not to contact parents as key members of an IEP team or get any other input from other sources. So it's very concerning the way that young people with disabilities who need IEPs are treated in these on-ground schools. So there's some consequences of this poor education, which is that young people with a history of residential placement complete fewer years of school. They do worse in school. They have lower high school graduation rates and much lower college enrollment rates than their peers. They're less likely to graduate on time, and they themselves don't set ambitious educational goals for themselves. They just don't think of themselves as someone who can be successful with school. So this is a little bit of background that leads us sort of back to where we started. Obviously, to prevent some of those harms, we want to really do more work like what Ava and Grace described, where they're preventing young people from getting caught up in this pipeline in the first place. But we also know that there's a bunch of kids who are already here, So young people who are already in the institutions that are circled on this slide, and they need help too. So one of the aims of our project was really focusing on how to help those young people who are already caught up in this. And when we talk about those young people, in Pennsylvania, 2018 is the last year that we have good data for. There are more than 7,500 young people who are sent to a secure detention facility, so a pre-trial holding, not going to their community school, not living in their home. Just about 3,000 youth admissions to a residential facility through the juvenile justice system, meaning that they're totally taken away from home, right? They've been placed sort of in, for adults, it would be the equivalent of in prison. And then we have approximately 4,000 young people in Pennsylvania every year sent to an institutional placement through the child welfare system. Plus, we've got a small number of young people who are sent to residential treatment facilities or drug and alcohol facilities. Many of those young people are also connected to the delinquency system or the dependency system. So this is a large number of Pennsylvania youth every year who are being sent away from home and experiencing the harms of congregate placement, including the educational harms. And one of the things we really need to think about is almost all of those young people come back. So here's our basic picture again, that's expanded a little bit because it shows young people moving from the school to the institutional, the prison or other institutional setting. Most of them also come home, and they come home to their community school as well. So really at its most basic level, when we're talking about the school to prison pipeline, we're talking about this piece, right? How after all the harms that happen while you're pushed out, what do things look like when you come back? And you know, generally schools are treating all these young people the same as they're coming back, regardless of what sort of setting they're coming from. There's one additional wrinkle that we need to talk about for this. So we've started with a really basic, you know, school, arrow, prison. We've expanded that model a little bit, and now it's about to get really complicated because this is actually what the school to prison pipeline looks like in Pennsylvania. For young people who are sent out of their home through the juvenile justice system in Pennsylvania, they have an average of 6 out-of-home placements. This whole, so, you know, here I have 6, we've represented it with 6 different types of facilities and an order of facilities where young people might go. So they may go from school to a detention center. Then they return home and they have to reintegrate back to school. They get picked up again. They get sent back to a detention center. This time, instead of going home, they go to a secure juvenile facility. Their time ends there. They go back home and back to school. They violate probation or parole, back to a secure facility, maybe shuffled around between multiple secure facilities, sent to a group home or other non-secure but residential facility until finally coming back home. This process occurs over the course of 3 years, and these young people spend an average of 16 months outside of their home setting. So we start to see why push out, you know, that initial school, arrow, prison is really key to keep kids out of this pipeline, because once they're in this pipeline, it's not so simple. And it's really a problem. But every single time that a young person comes back home and to a community school, there's also an opportunity, because we know that in each of these circumstances, right now, every time the kid has come back to home and school, now it has a red circle on this slide. There's an opportunity to use school to reconnect young people to their community, to have school be an anchor, to have it be a protective factor that helps things in the rest of their life go well. And we know, as Lisa and Ava and Grace kind of described what the school to prison pipeline is, we know that that's not happening, that every time these young people get back to school, they're getting caught back up in it again. So one of the things that we're really trying to look at in our work is how can we help school be a helping factor instead of a hurting factor for the kids who are being sent out of their communities now. So let me pass this to Paris to start talking more about that.
Thanks, Morgan. So initially, we kind of talked a lot about reentry. And so now we're trying to move to reintegration. So our work on educational reintegration. And what we mean by that is we've kind of seen like what the diagrams that Morgan just showed, those that's exemplifying reentry, right? So we're putting kids back in schools and they are kind of the agents of change in their lives. So they're kind of being set up as you have to fit, we got you back into the school. So now everything is up to you. And we have kind of seen those results of that here in Pennsylvania, where kids are being sent back into some kind of system, whether it be prison, not prison, but like the different facilities that Morgan has shown. So the project objectives, we are going to be we address the school to prison pipeline from the perspective of transitioning back into a community. So the educational setting following a juvenile justice, child welfare, or behavioral health residential placement. So we wanted to develop a model to ensure that all children and youth, including those with disabilities, children and youth of color with and without disabilities, and LGBTQIA+ identified youth will have the equal opportunity to a quality education when re-entering community school from a residential placement. So making sure that those entry points that Morgan mentioned before, that we are actually servicing, we're making it happen so that the kids are getting the supports that they need, so that that entry point is that only entry point, rather than them being displaced and then coming back again. So to accomplish this, the first 2 years, we looked at Philadelphia specifically, and we were looking at the reentry process for the Philadelphia school district. To do this, we convened working groups of relevant professionals around specific reentry topics. These included enrollment, special education, credit earning, transportation, many different things, where we convened different professionals to talk about the experiences from their different vantage points. We also spoke to students and their families about their experiences. So through this, we partnered with a couple of different agencies who worked with students more specifically. So not only did we kind of talk to them, but the students were also working on projects that help them dictate their experiences. So there's lots of material out there that kind of like have shown the experiences that kids go through when they're trying to transition back into school. And so we'll talk a little bit about those findings a little bit later. We also extended direct representation of reentry support to child advocate clients and families. We visually mapped the reentry process, which really kind of showed, I mean, maybe Morgan's probably more familiar with this because she does do the legal process. But for me, coming from like a social work view, we kind of like doing this process allowed us to see that kids are going from point A to point B to point C. Those points are usually siloed, so they're not really engaging with each other. And so when kids are being passed on to different agencies or the different steps to get into the school, point A doesn't necessarily know what point B is doing. And so if a kid is kind of having to navigate this on their own, or maybe their parents are not in the best position to kind of offer all the support they need, those kids are kind of like navigating these very, very confusing different stations on their own. And then so we also created the explanatory materials for system professionals, because like I said, these agencies were pretty siloed, so they don't necessarily know what was happening in the different, like once the kids are moving on to the next steps. And then we also created self-advocacy materials for students and their families, so that if they do have to navigate this on their own, that we can kind of give them some kind of directional material. So then we moved on to years 3 and 4, where we interviewed dozens of professionals who work in, whose work is relevant to educational reentry. So this is school districts, charter schools, on-ground schools, residential facilities, and juvenile justice, child welfare, and behavioral health systems. We also use the interviews and a literature review to create a practice guide for schools and systems that detail the most common barriers to educational reintegration and detail easily replicable practices that are currently in use in Pennsylvania schools. I also want to mention that we also engaged systemic reform initiatives at several of the residential facilities and on-ground schools that we spoke to, and continued direct representation for child advocates clients. So who we talked to, as you see by the two graphs we have here. So the first one's kind of denoting the people that we interviewed. The largest section of that is going to be district and intermediate unit level staff and administration and staff. We also had school level administration and staff. So that could be like principals, a lot of transition coordinators, residential education, administration and staff. And those are for the on-ground school, not on-ground schools, but the schools that are kind of attached to the not intermediate units, the different congregate care facilities. And we also had the, excuse me? Okay, sorry. And then the following graph just shows where those interviews took place at, like where they were who those people, where the people interviewed were coming from. So what did we ask? We started by asking the interviewees to describe the process the interviewee used or observed regarding their educational reentry. We asked them to assess the practices the interviewee used or observed on their effectiveness in facilitating a successful student reentry. We also asked them to identify barriers to a successful reentry from their specific perspective or role of the interviewee. We asked them to examine how best practices as identified in the relevant literature could be adopted by the interviewee's employer. And then finally, we asked all of the interviewees to choose a specific magic wand change to the current educational reentry practice that, if implemented, would have the largest beneficial effect. And then I'm going to pass it back to Morgan for the interview findings.
Thanks, Paris. As we spoke to all of those many people about their perspective on reintegrating young people when they are coming back to school, we kind of focused on a few different, topics, items. So we wanted to hear from them what they saw as the challenges, and then what they saw as the most important points to intervene to help the most important things for a successful reentry. So we don't have a ton of time today, so we're not going to go into great detail about any of those things, or also about the many, many excellent practice recommendations that the interviewees shared with us. But just to get a little taste, one of the biggest barriers that was identified for us is the lack of meaningful collaboration between everyone involved, all the different systems, the child, the family, the school. Just about every participant we interviewed said, this isn't working. Folks aren't talking. Part of the problem for that in Pennsylvania is we have 500 school districts plus an additional 200 charter schools that act as their own school district. So we have 700 entities plus dozens and dozens of congregate care facilities. So the odds of any of them having had previous interactions are just statistically very small. There's also no formal process for doing this. Everyone, every residential facility, every school district has a process, or they don't, or they have a formal process, or it's an informal one. There's no agency responsible to be the hub for making sure everyone's talking to each other. We also heard that a big frustration was that discharge planning isn't actually planned. Judges discharge kids from facilities with very little notice. Facilities can eject young people with little or no notice. Systems like the child welfare system might shuffle kids around between different facilities, very little notice. For a behavioral health facility, insurance may run out. And kids run away from these facilities. It happens actually quite frequently that young people vote with their feet about what is and isn't good for them, and they leave. So all of that forces schools to be reactive instead of proactive when kids are coming crashing back into the schools. Many of the folks we talked to said, oh, when young people are returning, we don't even know it's happening until they're literally back in our building. So without any advanced planning, it's hard to make the process go smoothly. There's a lot of gaps in the historical record, especially in the graph or the visual we saw where young people go from facility to facility and cycle back from home to congregate to home to congregate. Every single one of those facilities is creating a record. But that information doesn't always go with the student. So the receiving school often has no idea. One of the most important pieces is what special education supports that student needs. And so it takes a long time for them to put in the supports that are necessary. In the meantime, that young person without those supports disengages and drops out of school. Another common barrier that we heard is, we've talked about a little bit, when young people go from placement to placement to placement, all of those problems we just talked about are 10 times worse because nobody really generally knows the young person's history. They might have earned a half credit here, a quarter credit here, but no one has the information to put it all together. And then the final barrier that we heard from our interviewees about was that young people just aren't prepared to come back to their community school for a couple reasons. One is we don't listen to them and we don't ask them questions. We don't prioritize their voice. We prioritize the voice of professionals. The academics in the on-ground schools, like we talked about a couple minutes ago, are not generally rigorous. So kids are not academically ready to come back. And then they don't have the right supports that they need to come back. Special education supports, but other community school supports, leadership opportunities, extracurricular opportunities that would help them really reintegrate to a community as opposed to just coming back to a school. Oops. In terms of the key elements of reintegration, this is what we've taken from all the interviews as well as like Paris said, a literature review. Super important to look at enrolling students quickly and making sure they get into the right educational setting, to make sure that all of their student records transfer, to make sure that they earn credits for any coursework that they completed while they were in a residential placement. Putting special education accommodations and supports in right away and putting in the right supports is totally critical to keeping young people stable in school and not having them recycle back out of school.
having a welcoming school community that actively fights stigma and offers opportunities for extracurricular activities and leadership, and then to prioritize the voice of the students, seek their input, draw their families in as part of a team. Those are the critical pieces that we looked at. We have some really great recommendations from all kinds of different entities in each of these buckets. That is in a report that should be forthcoming literally any day now. And let me turn it back to Paris to talk about what we're doing in the year to come.
Yes, so I'm going to go over the next steps, but I am aware that we only have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try to keep it very quick. So our next steps, we have gotten all these recommendations from all these sources that we have mentioned. And so with that, we have kind of created trainings, systemic advocacy, and a pilot project to kind of like encapsulate that work and disperse it to relevant parties. So with the training, we are training to school districts, charter schools, pretty much anybody who is willing to have us. We are welcome to provide free trainings to you all about the work that we've done and how to like tangible ways to make the reentry process go from reentry to reintegration. Systemic advocacy, we have collected and disseminated information about pending policy and legislation to interested advocacy communities. And we have kind of heard that the #1 desire from the interviewees was to have a single record system. And that was also the #1 frustration from youth, was having lost credits. Lots of kids, like Morgan mentioned earlier, in classrooms with coloring books, thinking they're coming back to schools with credits and realizing that they're not, those credits do not exist. And it is demoralizing and leads to those kids dropping out of school. So research student record systems, and we're going to research student record systems in other jurisdictions and make recommendations to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And then lastly, we have started on a pilot project where we are identifying youth who are preparing for discharge. We're working with that youth and their family to create an aftercare plan, and then coordinating care between youth and community agencies. So helping that youth come from that placement and go back into the school and having all the supports needed and making sure that everything is in place so that that student can have a successful reintegration into that school. We're also going to collect the data to test the practicality and efficacy of the post-discharge support that we have kind of like studied so far. And with that, we have a minute to open it up to questions. If anybody wants to jump in really quickly. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to jump in about Kevin Nunez's question. What is the best way for councils to reach out to different diverse communities in your opinion? And like that, the strategy that Lisa has, like creating these, I think it's really about flexibility is something that we've learned from this project, where it's like you have to really go to places like things can't happen on like the terms of the organization. Like we have to figure out ways to go into communities and do things on their terms, because if we're working like on our kind of schedules, we tend to get like minds, which can be helpful because there are diverse opinions like within like minds. But if we really want to get into the communities, it sometimes takes like understanding communities and trying to make your way into it so that we can really understand the different perspectives that are happening in those communities.
So I think it's 3:30. So I'm going to help wrap up here. I'm going to thank Paris, Morgan, Eva, and Grace I'm just so proud and impressed with the work that you are all doing to address the very complex issues that contribute to the school to prison pipeline, not just in Pennsylvania. I mean, we're working in Pennsylvania, but I know this is an issue across the country and in all types of communities. So I want to thank you for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for coming. And I will just type my contact information into the chat box. If anybody wants to reach out and get any additional information, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Paris and Morgan's contact is on the slides, and we submitted our slides, so that has the contact information in there as well. So I want to thank the National Association for inviting us to present, and happy to work with any of you who have any follow-up questions or need more information. So thank you all. And I don't know, Brianna, if you have closing instructions.
I am going to continue with the thanks to all of you. Thank you again on behalf of the NACDD for all of you being here, and a huge thank you to each of the speakers. Truly, all the work you're all doing is so commendable and truly inspiring. So we will be on a break until 4 p.m., but then make sure to come back for the closing session, which will be on the main conference site. And again, it looks like everyone's putting their information in the chat, so feel free to follow up with anyone with any questions you may have. Thank you so much.